Morning. So this recording focuses on qualitative observations. You can also undertake observations quantitatively, and that will be covered in another recording later on. So when we talk about observation, it's actually a classic method of inquiry that originated in the sciences. So as you can see there, people like biologists, physicists, they used to observe things, and that's how we developed knowledge about various natural phenomena. But actually it is also now a social science method, and as I said, you can do it either quantitatively or qualitatively, but the focus here is on the qualitative. And as Saunders and co say there, it's a systematic observation, recording, description, analysis of people's behaviour. So it's something you do need to do quite purposefully and quite carefully and rigorously. So there are various times when we might want to observe rather than ask questions, and there's some examples here. So for example, sometimes you need to get that information through directly watching what's happening rather than through reports of others. So, a great example would be understanding levels of crowding at events like big sporting events, pop concerts, that sort of thing. And a lot of work there has been done with actually observing what happens in those crowds and how crowding takes place and how crowding problems emerge. And while you can ask people about their experiences, people won't necessarily know how many people they were in a particular place. They'll just have their feelings rather than, the physical, counting of number of people. And also, the people can't tell you what sort of happened at certain times because they're one individual within a mass. So if you're wanting to understand it more qualitatively, what's going on, you probably need to watch that. And then there's cases where the informants are unable to provide the information, or circumstances when they can only give very inexact answers. So, there's this, I've given examples there of, maybe young children, people who can't express themselves. But there's also occasions where, people actually aren't that overtly aware of what they're actually physically doing, so they can't necessarily tell you about it. And then there's also situations where we want to know what someone is actually doing rather than what they say she's doing. So people often recall things in a different way to what actually happens, so it can be quite useful to actually observe that behaviour. What it's not very good about is actually obviously understanding something that's happened in the past where you might have to ask people. It's not very good about understanding attitudes, and if you want to know how often some kind of behaviour happened, again, you can't find that out from observing because you just observe on that particular occasion. Having said that, as I say there, actually the way people act and actually watching people do things can tell us quite a lot about people's attitudes sometimes. So there's different kinds of data we can get from observation. The first one is literal data. This is very factual data, and this is typically what you might get when you collect quantitative data. So for instance, if you wanted to look at the number of people who were queuing at a bar in a festival, and see how that varied maybe over time, that would be literal data that you could go and actually just count the number of people in a queue. But also you can get a lot of factual data which is qualitative, so it could be, for instance, things like what kind of clothing people are wearing. What is the dress code? That's quite literal data too, and might be something you might collect more qualitatively. And then there's interpretive data. This is assumptions that are being made by the researcher. So as a researcher, you interpret people's behaviour. So I've given the example there of looking at people stood in a queue and observing that they're bored, which is fairly likely, but they might not be. But it's the sort of thing that you can observe. You can pick up facial expressions. You can pick up people's demeanour. And then there's reflexive data. Now, reflexive data is the researcher themselves reacting to what they see or they experience. And I've got an example here of when I took part as a researcher in a multicultural lunch, which took place in a church hall. And for me, I was quite surprised that it was in a church hall because it had a particular, religious setting. And also I felt slightly excluded as a non-religious person. So there was a quite interesting that's a bit of kind of reflexive data, reflecting on how comfortable different people might feel being in a setting that was linked to a particular religious group. And then in terms of our qualitative observations, it's something that actually, because we're people, we're quite good at doing. We interpret people's behaviour and we read this kind of non-linguistic behaviour all the time. So for most of us, it's actually quite an intuitive process to do observations, and can be quite something enjoyable and something that we will naturally do. And it has its origins in social anthropology, but it does demand quite a lot of attention from you as a researcher to do qualitative research observations. It's also used in commercial research. So I've given a number of examples here, linked to some of the topic areas where you're studying. So there's been quite a lot of work looking at how people consume products and services. So for instance, what happens in restaurants, bars, theme parks, festivals, venues, sporting events. So these are areas where it's all been used. And then there's been this, what we call the moment of truth research, where people do observations of people on shopping trips and actually can, interpret what's happening when people select a product from a shelf. So, and as you can see there, that's often linked to this research where you will actually accompany people on the shopping trips. And actually people have accompanied people in all sorts of other settings. So there are accompanying people to events. We had a PhD student who did a lot of participant observation at festivals a few years ago very successfully. And there have been people who've done walk-alongs with people. And I had a student who walked along with people at a live event last winter, actually. And that was, again, very, very useful. And then there's the decision you have to make about whether you undertake observations covertly, where people don't know that you're there undertaking the observations, or overtly. Overtly is where you've told people that you're undertaking observations. So here there are issues to do with trustworthiness. So one of the problems is when you tell people you're observing them, it tends to affect the behaviour of people, and there are a lot of well-known studies that show observation effects. So some of you might have heard of the Hawthorne studies, where observations were undertaken in a factory, and actually people's productivity in the factory went up because they were basically being watched. So you have to think about the impact you have on people and how they might behave differently as to which approach you drop. But one thing is there are quite significant ethical considerations here, and generally, in terms of doing ethical research, we would typically want to tell people that we're observing them, but obviously there can be situations where you won't be able to, but that does need to be considered in your, when you undertake your ethical assessment of your research. So where there's major challenges, for instance, would be observing children, and that's, generally, could be problematic. But, it's something to really give some thought about. Many years ago, a friend of mine did some research on her master's project. She was a landscape architect and she was interested in people's use of urban spaces. And one of the things that she did was she picked random people and followed them for half an hour around on their shopping trip around the town centre without telling them. Now, I think that kind of research now would be considered very unethical. Because actually someone maybe become aware that they were being followed. But at the time, when perhaps there were less concerns about this, she was able to do that. But probably challenging these days. Then you have to decide how much you participate and how much you just observe. So this ranges from being a complete participant to a complete observer. Now, as a complete participant, you take place in the activity that you're observing, and you're wholly concealed. So people don't know that you're doing the observations. This is covert observation. And this has led to some some really interesting research where people have participated in groups and come to get some understanding, for instance, of things like football violence in the past. So it can be quite useful for getting involved with a group and actually understanding what's happening with that group. Then you have participant observer, where the activities are not totally concealed, but they're kept under wraps. So an example here is people who are organising an activity might know that you're there as a participant observer, but maybe the participants themselves don't know. And it's possible because it's just difficult to tell all those participants. So for instance, imagine you're going to a live event and you're going as an observer. You might get permission from the event organiser, but you can't necessarily get permission from all the people taking part in that event. That would be problematic. Similarly, if you were doing some observations at a hotel, you might be able to tell, might get permission from the hotel managers, but not necessarily from all the guests. And then you've got observer as participant, and this is when you make the activities public at the outset. So one of my colleagues did some research in an ecotourism context where she joined an ecotourism tour operation, and she actually told all the people on the trip that she was undertaking observations. So it was very overt from the start, and that's because it was a relatively small group. We're talking about a group of about 15 to 20 people, so they could be all informed that the researcher was joining them on the trip. And then you have complete observer, and actually this can be overt or covert, because you can just observe people from a distance, and there's even been research done behind a one-way mirror. But so it can range from no one knows you're there observing things to being completely public. Now, there's many advantages, because it actually sometimes gives us this ability to understand quite holistically what's going on. So the PhD student who observed festivals gained a lot of useful knowledge, particularly about how participants co-created the experience at festivals. And another advantage is it's very inductive, discovery-orientated approach, so you can explore things in detail. So the student operating at a festival, she observed things, she was able to go and talk to people about them. She was able to begin to make conclusions and then explore those with people in that festival setting. You sometimes see things that may escape conscious awareness. So, where you might lose that if you try to ask people about it. And you can observe things that the respondents wouldn't normally be willing to talk about. So, this could be various forms of possibly illegal behaviour. I'm thinking about festival contacts there and things like drug use. So, there are interesting things that you might be able to get at a bit more through observations. In terms of disadvantages, there is quite a significant problem with the fieldworker bias, because the way that you as a researcher interprets what you see can be very biased without you realising. And as Patton says there, human perception is highly selective. So we select to see certain things, we don't always see other things or understand other things that are happening. And a lot depends on our background, so this could be cultural, it could be childhood experiences, it could be more recent experiences. So we all bring what we call our baggage with us, which is our experiences that we have that come to bear on that setting. And therefore, our own value system will tell us how to interpret what we're seeing. So that can be problematic. In terms of doing it, recording it can be quite tricky, particularly if you're actually observing as a participant, because you don't necessarily want to be seen taking lots of notes. So the typical way of recording is through field notes, which is fine if you're just observing and people know you're observing and you can do it overtly. But if you're actually taking part in an activity, that might be more practical. So often what people do is keep a diary after a period of observation. And I know some people carry little notebooks with them, so they have their little notebook in a pocket or in a bag. And sometimes I remember someone saying how they used to nip to the toilet every once in a while to write down notes quickly about things that they had seen. But generally you keep some kind of notes as you go along. You can also video things, and you can also audio record things. But obviously, if you're doing that, you need to tell people that you're making those recordings, and that can then influence what's going on. You can also use photographs. Obviously, they only capture an instant. They don't. Sorry, my cat's joining in again. They don't capture the ongoing process. So you have to think through how you're going to get your data together. You can also observe online, and actually, interestingly, social media provides a sort of live platform to observe online, and you can fairly readily capture that kind of data through things like screenshots. And also Zoom meetings now are quite an interesting thing. If you were sort of researching maybe some, say like you were researching a tourism development process for a destination, and you were taking part in a number of stakeholder meetings, then, and they were taking place on Zoom, well, subject to permissions, you could record those Zoom meetings, and actually then you'd have a whole load of observation data on the interactions in those meetings that were going towards, say, some kind of destination development project. So there is potentially scope to record there more. What we'd normally have is some kind of observation protocol. Even if you have a fairly open-ended approach, it's useful to have a list of some things that you might want to observe. And we have some quite practical things, which you mustn't forget, things like the date, time, location, the name of the activity, the event, what it is you're observing. I would typically describe the location as well, or the setting, so if it's online, describe that online setting in some detail. And, if it's something like a particular event, or, it's, so I'd describe the wider location and then the very specific thing that I'm looking at. So if I was looking in a restaurant or an event, I'd cover things like room layout, its appearance, crowding, that kind of thing. Then you might think about the different activities being undertaken, the people who are present. So things like, you can record things about their characteristics like gender, age, ethnicity, whether people appear to be in couples, families, that sort of thing. Things like people's dress code. You can also observe social interactions. So, the way people are interacting, is it particular kinds of groups that are interacting? Is it children interacting? So, for instance, in some work I've done at campsites, one of the things that we observed was that children, when people are camping, the children interact a lot. And through children's interactions, the parents often then begin to interact, but it's usually children who do the first stage of the interactions. Then you can actually look at things like the way people interact with things. So, for example, that might be food in a hospitality setting, but it could be other things around them. So, for instance, in the campsite setting, you can look at things like, what's happening when people are doing the washing up, because actually that's where also quite a lot of social interactions take place. You can also make note about conversations, so you might chat with people, you might even overhear other conversations, you might be part of bigger conversations, and you can make notes of things that people have said. And then there's your own personal reflections as well, and that's another aspect that you can note down. Sorry about my cat. She never goes away, she just thinks it's weird that I'm talking at a computer. So lots of things to sort of think about there, but could be a very useful tool, but one where we do need to carefully consider the ethical issues. So one of the things I would suggest actually with all of your methods is, once you've decided what you want to do, is actually have a careful think about the ethical issues too, and there may be more of them here with qualitative observations.